At 5:42 a.m. on June 10, 1944, 16-year-old Simone Segouin crouched behind an overturned farm cart on the outskirts of Chartres, her fingers wrapped around a German MP40 submachine gun she had captured 3 days earlier. 200 meters down the dirt road, a Wehrmacht supply convoy was approaching, 3 trucks carrying ammunition and rations toward German positions north of the city. Her FFI commander had given explicit orders: let them pass. The Partisan unit wasn't strong enough to engage regular German forces in daylight, but Simone had spent the past week watching German soldiers execute French civilians for suspected resistance activities, had seen bodies hanging from signs warning against sabotage, and she had decided that orders mattered less than action. She raised her weapon and sighted on the lead truck's windshield. Her companion, a 23-year-old veteran of the French defeat in 1940, grabbed her arm and whispered urgently that engaging would bring German reprisals on the entire village. She shook him off without taking her eyes from the target. The convoy slowed as it approached a turn in the road, and she opened fire in controlled 3-round bursts exactly as she had taught herself through practice and observation. The lead truck's windshield shattered and the vehicle swerved violently into a ditch. German soldiers poured from the other trucks, taking cover and returning fire, but Simone had already shifted position, moving through the hedgerows with the agility that came from having grown up in this countryside. Over the next 7 minutes, she and 3 other partisans who joined the engagement killed 6 German soldiers, destroyed 2 trucks, and scattered the convoy, before melting back into the fields and forests they knew intimately. German forces would spend the entire day searching for the attackers, burning 2 farmhouses in reprisal and arresting 5 men they suspected of involvement. But they never found the teenage girl who had initiated the attack, the blonde 16-year-old who had become one of the most effective partisan fighters in occupied France despite being too young to vote, too young to legally drink, too young by every conventional measure to be leading ambushes against professional soldiers. Simone Segouin was born on October 3, 1925, in Chartres, a historic cathedral city in north-central France, about 90 kilometers southwest of Paris. She grew up in a working-class family during the politically turbulent 1930s, when France struggled with economic depression, political polarization, and the rising threat of Nazi Germany. Her father worked as a farmer and laborer, her mother managed the household, and Simone attended local schools, where she was known as a capable student with a stubborn, independent streak that frequently got her in trouble with teachers who expected girls to be quiet and compliant. She had 3 brothers, and unlike most French girls of her generation who were channeled toward domestic skills and marriageable accomplishments, she spent her childhood exploring the forests and fields around Chartres, learning to track animals, navigate by landmarks, and move silently through terrain. These skills, developed through play and curiosity, would later prove invaluable for partisan warfare. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, Simone was 14 years old and witnessed the catastrophic collapse of French military resistance. German forces bypassed the Maginot Line fortifications, swept through the Ardennes forest, and reached Paris in 6 weeks, forcing French surrender on humiliating terms. The armistice divided France into German-occupied northern and western zones and a nominally independent southern zone governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime. Chartres fell within the occupied zone, and Simone watched German troops march through her city, requisition buildings, impose curfews, and begin implementing occupation policies designed to extract maximum economic benefit from France while suppressing any resistance. The occupation transformed daily life completely. Food became scarce due to German requisitions, schools taught revised curricula emphasizing French weakness and German superiority, and the Gestapo arrested anyone suspected of opposition. Young Frenchmen were conscripted for forced labor in German factories, Jewish families were registered and eventually deported, and collaborators profited by denouncing neighbors to German authorities. By 1943, the character of German occupation had evolved from relatively restrained control to brutal suppression as the Nazi military position deteriorated. The Wehrmacht's defeat at Stalingrad, Allied victories in North Africa, and the intensifying strategic bombing campaign created an atmosphere of German paranoia and French hope that the occupation might eventually end. Resistance activities escalated accordingly, with networks conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and attacks on German personnel and collaborators. The German response was savage and indiscriminate. For every German soldier killed by partisans, occupation authorities executed dozens of French hostages. They burned villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters, tortured suspects to reveal network members, and displayed executed partisans publicly as warnings. Around Chartres, resistance activities were initially limited to passive measures: circulating underground newspapers, hiding Allied airmen who had been shot down, providing intelligence to London via radio operators. But as Allied invasion appeared increasingly likely and German repression intensified, some resistors concluded that passive opposition was inadequate. Simone's introduction to active resistance came through a family friend named Lieutenant Roland Boursier, who was organizing an FFRI unit in the Chartres region. The FFRI, Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, was the umbrella organization that attempted to coordinate various resistance factions under unified command in preparation for Allied invasion. Boursier was recruiting fighters for sabotage operations and guerrilla attacks designed to disrupt German communications and supply lines. Most recruits were men in their 20s and 30s, veterans of France's defeat in 1940, or younger men avoiding forced labor conscription. When Simone, age 17 in early 1944, approached Boursier and asked to join, he initially refused, explaining that resistance work was too dangerous for teenagers, and especially for women. She countered that she knew the local terrain better than most men twice her age, that she could move through German-controlled areas without arousing suspicion because soldiers didn't view teenage girls as threats, and that she was willing to learn whatever skills were necessary. She also pointed out the uncomfortable truth that the resistance desperately needed bodies and couldn't afford to reject willing volunteers based on age or gender. The French resistance movement, despite operating outside legal frameworks and official authority, maintained its own internal hierarchies and prejudices that often excluded women from combat roles. FFY commanders generally assigned women to support functions: couriers carrying messages between cells, nurses treating wounded fighters, safe house operators providing shelter, or intelligence gatherers who could move through German checkpoints with less scrutiny than men. Direct combat was considered men's work, requiring physical strength, emotional hardness, and tactical aggression that military tradition assumed women lacked. When Simone insisted on participating in armed operations rather than accepting support roles, her FFI cell's leadership held multiple meetings to debate whether allowing her to fight would set dangerous precedents or compromise operational effectiveness. Some commanders argued that her presence would distract male fighters, that she lacked the physical strength for extended combat, and that her capture would result in sexual violence that male prisoners wouldn't face. Others pointed out more pragmatically that the resistance couldn't afford to waste anyone willing to fight, that partisan warfare relied more on stealth and marksmanship than physical strength, and that Simone's ability to move through German positions without arousing suspicion gave her tactical advantages male fighters didn't possess. The compromise reached was typical of institutional resistance to women combatants. She could participate in operations, official rank or recognition. Her involvement would be informal rather than officially sanctioned, and commanders retained the right to exclude her from specific missions they deemed too dangerous. Simone accepted these terms because they gave her the access she wanted, but she also largely ignored the restrictions, volunteering for dangerous missions and taking initiative in combat situations regardless of whether commanders had authorized her involvement. Training for partisan warfare in occupied France bore little resemblance to conventional military instruction because secrecy requirements prevented formal training camps or extended exercises. Simone learned combat skills through improvised methods that combined instruction from experienced fighters, personal experimentation, and learning under fire. Lieutenant Boursier taught her basic weapons handling using captured German firearms and weapons dropped by British aircraft in nighttime supply operations. She learned to strip, clean, and fire the MP40 submachine gun, the standard German infantry weapon that became her signature firearm. The MP40 was relatively lightweight, fired 9mm rounds in automatic or semi-automatic mode, and was reliable even with minimal maintenance, critical factors for partisans operating without access to armories or gunsmiths. She practiced marksmanship in secluded forest clearings, learning to control the weapon's recoil and manage ammunition efficiently because partisan units chronically lacked supplies. She studied German patrol patterns, learning when and where Wehrmacht units moved through the Chartres region, identifying vulnerable points where small partisan forces could attack and escape before German reinforcements arrived. She memorized backroads, forest paths, and drainage ditches that could serve as escape routes after operations. She learned to move silently through undergrowth, to remain motionless for hours while observing enemy positions, and to navigate at night without flashlights. Most importantly, she cultivated the psychological detachment necessary for killing at close range. Her first combat experience came during a nighttime sabotage operation in May 1944 when her cell attacked a railway line carrying German supplies. She served as lookout while experienced saboteurs placed explosives. But when a German patrol stumbled onto the operation, she engaged them with her MP40, killing at least one soldier before the partisans scattered. The experience was terrifying and disorienting, nothing like the controlled practice sessions, but it proved to her and to skeptical male comrades that she could function effectively in combat despite her age and gender. The climax of Simone's resistance activities came during the liberation of Chartres in August 1944, a chaotic week of urban combat where FFY partisans fought alongside advancing American forces to expel German defenders. When American units reached the outskirts of Chartres on August 16th, German forces were still entrenched in the city center, holding key buildings and bridges while preparing to retreat northward. FFY units, including Simone's cell, were ordered to support American operations by conducting reconnaissance, identifying German positions, and harassing enemy forces to prevent organized withdrawal. On August 17th, Simone participated in an urban assault on a German strongpoint in a municipal building where Wehrmacht soldiers were directing artillery fire on American positions. The attack began at dawn with a coordinated advance through residential streets, partisans moving between buildings, while American tanks provided covering fire. Simone carried her MP40 and wore a captured German ammunition belt, her blonde hair tucked under a military cap, indistinguishable from male fighters, except for her slight build. When the assault stalled under heavy German fire from fortified positions, she volunteered to approach the building through a drainage system that ran beneath the street, emerging inside the German perimeter where defenders weren't expecting attack. She crawled through sewage and darkness for nearly 30 minutes, emerged in a courtyard behind German lines, and opened fire on soldiers who were focused on the frontal assault, killing 3 before they understood they were being attacked from behind. The disruption allowed American and FFI forces to rush the building, capturing it with minimal friendly casualties. A French photographer named Robert Capa, embedded with American forces, captured an iconic image of Simone during the liberation fighting. She's walking through a Chartres street carrying her MP40, wearing a Wehrmacht ammunition belt and looking directly at the camera with an expression mixing exhaustion, defiance, and something approaching joy. The photograph would become one of the most famous images of French resistance, though for decades she would remain misidentified or anonymous in publications that couldn't reconcile the teenage girl in the picture with the combat veteran the context implied. After Chartres' liberation, Allied and French military authorities conducted investigations into resistance activities, partly to document German war crimes and collaboration, partly to assess which resistance members deserved recognition and military integration. FFY units were being formalized into regular French army formations, a process that required determining who had genuinely fought and who was claiming false credentials, now that resistance was safe and potentially profitable. Simone's combat record was thoroughly documented because multiple witnesses, including American soldiers and Robert Capa's photographs, confirmed her participation in significant operations. Military investigators were particularly interested in her story because it contradicted prevailing assumptions about women's roles in resistance and provided propaganda value for demonstrating French contributions to their own liberation. However, the investigation also revealed tensions about how to integrate female combatants into traditional military structures. French army regulations had no framework for incorporating women as combat soldiers rather than auxiliary personnel. Investigators documented her activities but struggled with how to classify them officially. Some commanders argued she should be given formal military rank equivalent to her combat contributions. Others insisted that doing so would create impossible precedents for thousands of women who had participated in resistance but within support roles. The compromise was typical. She received official recognition as an FFI member and was authorized to wear military insignia but wasn't given formal rank or integrated into regular army units. She was celebrated in propaganda as a symbol of French resistance, but not actually incorporated into military command structures where her experience might have had practical value. This pattern repeated across France as female resistance veterans found themselves honored symbolically but excluded practically from post-liberation military and political institutions. News of Simone's combat record spread rapidly through liberated France and beyond, partly through genuine documentation, partly through propaganda embellishment that transformed her into a symbol larger than her actual experiences. Robert Capa's photograph appeared in Life magazine and other international publications, making her face familiar to millions of readers who knew nothing about her beyond the caption identifying her as a French resistance fighter. The image was powerful precisely because it contradicted expectations. Viewers saw a teenage girl, blonde and slight, carrying weapons and wearing military gear that signified combat experience typically associated with hardened male soldiers. The photograph became evidence that French resistance had been genuine and significant, countering German propaganda that had dismissed resistance as minor criminal activity and allied skepticism about whether France had earned liberation or simply received it as a gift. Other female resistance fighters gained recognition in Simone's wake, though rarely with the same visibility. Entire FFY units that had included women combatants documented their contributions, and historians began acknowledging that women's participation in resistance had extended far beyond support roles. The French government created decorations and recognition programs for resistance veterans, and women were included, though often in separate categories that emphasized their auxiliary status. Simone received the Croix de Guerre and other military honors, was promoted to lieutenant in recognition of her combat service, and participated in official liberation celebrations and victory parades. Her story was adapted into newspaper articles, radio programs, and eventually books that presented her as exemplifying French determination and courage. However, the celebration of individual heroines like Simone sometimes obscured the systematic nature of women's resistance contributions, treating exceptional women as anomalies rather than acknowledging that thousands of women had fought, gathered intelligence, sheltered fugitives, and risked execution throughout the occupation. The validation she received was genuine but also carefully bounded. She could be celebrated as a heroic teenager who had fought Nazis, but acknowledging the full implications of her story would have required rethinking gender roles and military traditions that French society wasn't ready to abandon. The French military and political establishment struggled to reconcile Simone's combat record with institutional assumptions about gender and warfare. She had unquestionably fought effectively, killed enemy soldiers, and contributed tactically to France's liberation. Multiple American and French officers had witnessed her combat performance and confirmed her effectiveness. Photographs documented her carrying weapons and participating in operations. Yet, integrating her formally into military structures proved difficult because doing so challenged fundamental assumptions about who could be a soldier. Some military leaders argued for creating special recognition categories for female resistance fighters that acknowledged their contributions without implying they were equivalent to male soldiers. Others insisted that combat performance should be the only relevant criterion and that Simone deserved the same rank and recognition as any male fighter with equivalent experience. The debate revealed deeper anxieties about what women's combat participation meant for French society. If teenage girls could fight as effectively as trained soldiers, what did that say about military institutions that had excluded women? If women could kill enemy soldiers and survive combat, what justification remained for restricting them to domestic and support roles? These questions were uncomfortable for a society trying to restore pre-war normalcy after years of occupation and upheaval. The solution was characteristically ambiguous. Simone received military decorations and honors, was allowed to wear military insignia and participate in official ceremonies, but wasn't integrated into regular army command or given authority matching her experience. She was celebrated as an exceptional individual whose courage deserved recognition, but whose example didn't necessarily indicate that policies should change. This allowed French institutions to honor her without confronting the systematic gender discrimination her story revealed. Simone Segouin survived the war, married, raised 3 children, and lived quietly in the Chartres region for decades, rarely discussing her resistance activities except when journalists or historians specifically sought her out. She worked as a pediatric nurse, a profession that seemed to validate traditional assumptions about women's natural roles, even as her wartime record contradicted those assumptions. The contrast between her public image as a teenage resistance fighter and her post-war life as a wife, mother, and nurse became itself a subject of analysis. Had she been pressured to abandon combat roles and embrace conventional femininity, or had she chosen domestic life freely after experiencing warfare's brutality? The question assumed these identities were contradictory, that someone who fought in combat couldn't genuinely want domestic life afterward. Simone herself rejected this framing, insisting that she had fought because circumstances demanded it, not because she wanted to be a soldier permanently, and that choosing peaceful domestic life after liberation was its own form of victory. Her story became important to multiple constituencies with different interpretations. Feminists cited her as evidence that women could perform any role men could. Military historians studied her tactical contributions. French nationalists celebrated her as exemplifying resistance, and educational programs used her story to teach about occupation and liberation. The photograph of her in Chartres with her MP40 became iconic, reproduced in textbooks and documentaries, though for decades she remained less famous than the image itself. In 2014, at age 88, she participated in the 70th anniversary commemorations of Chartres' liberation, finally receiving extensive media attention and public recognition. She was promoted to lieutenant and awarded the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, France's highest distinction. She died in 2023 at age 97, having lived long enough to see her contributions properly acknowledged and to witness dramatic changes in women's military participation that her generation had initiated. The 16-year-old who took on the Nazi army proved that courage, tactical skill, and moral commitment weren't determined by age or gender, but by individual choice in moments when doing nothing was intolerable and doing something, however dangerous, was the only acceptable option. Her legacy demonstrates that resistance takes forms conventional military institutions don't always recognize, that effectiveness in warfare depends more on adaptability and determination than on fitting traditional soldier profiles, and that sometimes the most powerful challenges to tyranny come from those the system never expected to fight back.